This happened when I was 15, near Maplewood Park. My father and I were driving to our cabin in the middle of winter. I had always been captivated by the beauty of the park and the surrounding region, having spent every summer there enjoying the scenery. Our cabin was situated on a large lake about a half-hour's drive from the nearest town. In the summer, the lake was filled with cottages, and the town's population would swell. People came to spend their days on the water, enjoying the warm nights around campfires with loved ones. I grew up spending every summer there, and those days are still etched in my memory, full of sunshine, laughter, and the hum of motorboats on the water. But winter was different. People who didn't live there year-round would leave, returning to the city, leaving the area mostly quiet, with cottages locked up for the season. A few folks would visit occasionally, but for the most part, the lake was still and the town was left to its locals. The tall pine trees were always dusted with snow, making the forest peaceful and still. Our cabin sat on a dead-end road with about 20 other cottages scattered around. Ours was in the middle of the road, and the houses were spaced far apart, with the closest neighbor too far to see through the trees. It was the end of February, and my dad needed to head up to the cabin to do some painting that my mom had been nagging him about. It was a long weekend, so I decided to come along so he wouldn't be alone and we could spend some time together. The drive from our home was usually about 5 hours, but the snowstorm turned it into an 8-hour journey. By the time we passed Maplewood Park, it had gotten very dark, and it was around midnight. The roads were quiet and pitch black, except for the car's headlights. We finally made it through the park, with just a half hour left to reach the cabin. The snow had stopped falling, and both of us were eager to arrive. As we turned onto the familiar road, my dad muttered about how it hadn't been plowed yet. It wasn't surprising, as we knew it wouldn't be cleared until at least the next day. Driving down the road, I noticed fresh tire tracks in the snow. "The Johnsons must be up for the weekend," my dad commented. Then, as we rounded a bend and followed the tracks, the headlights illuminated a white van parked on the side of the road, mostly hidden by the tall snow-covered trees. "What the?" my dad mumbled as we passed it. I glanced out the back window and saw 2 figures in the front seat, briefly lit by our fading taillights. I mentioned it to my dad, and he just shrugged. "Maybe they're lost." I nodded but couldn't help wondering why they would park on a dead-end road in the middle of the night. Once we arrived at the cabin and started unloading, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling about the van. I kept thinking about it, about the people sitting in the dark, just waiting in the middle of nowhere. I became so uneasy that I begged my dad to let me sleep upstairs with him instead of in the downstairs room I usually shared with my sister. The room had large windows with no blinds, and from there you could see straight into the forest. I was already scared of the dark, and with the strange van in mind, I wasn't about to sleep alone in that room. After my dad settled in for bed, I stayed downstairs in the living room reading. He turned off the lights, leaving me to read by the dim light of a small lamp next to the couch, trying to finish my book before bed. The silence was almost deafening, and I began to feel like someone was watching me. The living room had big windows too, without curtains, and it overlooked the lake, which was completely dark except for a few distant lights from cottages across the water. I switched off the lamp and stood up, wanting to look outside. The moonlight was bright and reflected off the snow, making everything look serene and beautiful. As I walked toward the window, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye, and my heart skipped a beat. 2 figures stood near the back porch, barely visible behind the trees. I immediately dropped to the floor and crawled quickly to my dad's room. My heart was racing, and I wasn't sure if they had seen me. I woke him up, and by the time he got to the window, the figures were gone. The next morning, my dad went outside to check, and sure enough, there were 2 sets of footprints in the snow, leading from the road behind our cabin, around the front and back toward the driveway. He noticed tire tracks showing that the van had turned around and driven back up the road. My dad speculated that they might have been planning to break into one of the empty cottages, knowing that not many people were up at the lake during winter. They probably saw our tire tracks and my dad's car parked out front. They might also have noticed the light in the living room when I was reading, or seen it go out when I turned it off. Although my dad wasn't too alarmed, he still decided to call the non-emergency line to report it. There had been some recent break-ins in the area, and a few cottages had been robbed while their owners were away for the season. But I still wonder to this day why anyone would risk robbing a cabin when they could clearly see someone was there. Or perhaps their intentions were darker than we ever thought. In 2006, just as the Motorola Razr flip phone was becoming a sensation, it reached my small mountain town. Once a prosperous mining area in the late 1800s, it had since faded into obscurity. The mines ran dry, and the town was left behind. Abandoned homes dotted the outskirts, slowly being reclaimed by nature. But in our small rural community, there was one house that stood out, the Master House, which we kids all knew of. It wasn't really a house, more of a two-story cabin in the woods, standing near the mine's entrance. Over time, we had heard stories. The house belonged to the mining master's family, who had lived there for convenience, right next to the mine. But when the mine closed, they mysteriously vanished, leaving everything behind: clothes, dishes, and more. The house remained empty, and for us, that was odd enough to stir our curiosity. One day, a group of us was bored at a friend's house. It was summer, and the evening sun was still bright. After some time playing Xbox, someone suggested checking out the Master House, something none of us had visited. Though I was hesitant at first, the idea intrigued me. It felt like the only exciting thing to do in this sleepy town. So, we piled into my friend's car, grabbed flashlights, and drove to the trailhead. The sun was setting, and we knew we had just enough time to explore before it disappeared. The walk to the cabin was about 45 minutes. We hiked through the dense woods, chatting excitedly, wondering what treasures might have been left behind. When we finally reached the cabin, it wasn't a house at all, but a spooky, two-story cabin. The place looked abandoned and eerie, especially in the fading light. Standing at its base, we all felt a strange stillness. The sounds of nature, the wind, and animals seemed to vanish. Everything went silent. We stood frozen, staring at the front door. The cabin had clearly aged, with the wood bleached by the sun. I stepped onto the stone steps and pushed the door open, which creaked without resistance. Inside, it smelled musty, like decay. Felt like something had died there. We cautiously ventured inside, where graffiti adorned the walls and a few scattered items like spoons and plates remained. Other explorers must have passed through. We checked out the downstairs and noticed the stairs leading up. We were drawn to the upper floor, so we cautiously made our way up. Each step groaned under our weight. As we reached the top, I shone my flashlight to the left and saw a few bedrooms. Then, turning to the right, I spotted a door slightly ajar. As I approached and pushed it open, I dropped my flashlight in shock. A mannequin stood in the room, dressed in an old, frilly dress, clearly left behind by whoever had come before us. My friends laughed at my fright, thinking it was a harmless prank, but I couldn't shake the unease. We continued exploring. One friend found old papers scattered around, and we marveled at the relics. But the fun wore off quickly. Everyone else had clearly been there before us, and we were done with this ghost hunt. It was nearly dark, and none of us wanted to walk back through the forest in complete darkness. So, we made our way down the stairs, when one of my friends said he needed to step outside. As we waited for him, we heard footsteps above us. I called out, asking who was still upstairs, but there was no reply. I counted us all again. 5 in total, but downstairs were only 4, with my friend outside. Just as I finished counting, we heard a single step upstairs, the creak of a floorboard. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances. In that moment, we bolted from the cabin, not daring to look back. We met up with our friend outside, who seemed confused. He insisted it was just an animal or the wind causing the sounds. Though the fear had faded, we still needed to get home. As we walked back, I realized something was wrong. My phone was missing. I had been showing it off, taking pictures of the cabin. I must have left it behind. I didn't want to go back, but Sam, one of my friends, offered to come with me. The others waited by the trees. We re-entered the cabin, and as we searched the downstairs, I opened a drawer and found a decomposing bird inside. I was horrified but continued searching for my phone. We moved upstairs and checked the rooms, but I felt uneasy the whole time. Then it was time to look in the mannequin room again. The door was ajar from earlier, and when I entered, I saw my phone, right at the mannequin's feet. I was baffled. I had never gone near that room after my first scare. My only conclusion was that one of my friends had taken it and placed it there as a prank. As we left, I mentioned to my friends that I found my phone in the mannequin room. They all seemed confused, saying they hadn't moved anything. One of them even recalled seeing me leave it on a side table earlier. I didn't mention the mannequin, just the phone. They looked at each other and then at me and asked why I had been moving the mannequin. I was confused and asked them what they meant. They said that after we had left, the mannequin had moved, shifting positions and sitting back in the chair. I turned to look through the window, and the mannequin was gone. There was no trace of it. Fear gripped me, and we all ran out of the cabin. We were exhausted when we reached the end of the trail and got back to the car. We all shared our versions of the night. None of my friends had moved my phone, and they hadn't seen anything strange. But still, I can't explain it. I trust my friends, and they seemed genuinely confused about the mannequin. Maybe it was a trick of the light, but what I know for sure is that I'll never set foot in that cabin again. In 2013, I found myself living in an old cabin that was well over 200 years old. A childhood friend of mine had asked me to move in with her as a roommate. I was eager to leave my parents' house, and she needed someone to share the rent, so it seemed like a good arrangement. The cabin was tucked away in a suburban neighborhood, but it had a fascinating history. It was originally built in the 1700s, and the road it sat on was named after the original family, the Bears. They had once owned a large chunk of the land, which has now become part of one of the largest cities in the United States. The cabin itself resembled those American colonial homes you can find in old pictures. We initially thought it had been used as slave quarters, given that the area was known for tobacco farming. Later, we discovered it was likely a stable house. Our dog once dug up an old horseshoe, which we still have to this day. The night we moved in, there was an odd atmosphere. My room, located upstairs, had no door, and the downstairs bedroom, where my roommate slept, was an addition built in the 1980s. The previous owners had also added a kitchen and bathroom, as the original house didn't have either. From the moment I moved in, I felt like I was being watched. The house was always dark, cold, and damp, like a cellar. It was the kind of feeling you might expect in an old home, but there was something else. Each night, I'd hear scratching sounds while lying in bed, right beneath my head. At first, I assumed it was mice, but the sound didn't match. It was a slow, drawn-out scratch, almost like something was pulling itself across the floor. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head and covering my ears, though I felt foolish at 23 years old, hiding from whatever it was. One night, I stayed up late, and the scratching started again. This time, I was wide awake. It started on the far side of the room on the ceiling, then moved down the wall before continuing under the bed. After a while, it seemed to move across the room and back to the wall. It stopped soon after, but it was unsettling. The house was made of thick, solid wood, with no gaps in the floor or walls. It wasn't mice. Feeling more and more uneasy, I began sleeping downstairs in the living room. My roommate, now my wife, noticed that I was avoiding my room. When I told her about the strange noises, she revealed she had been hearing the same things when she was alone in the house. The oddities didn't stop there. When we first moved in, I had to unscrew a bunch of bolts from the windows and even had to open a door that had been nailed shut. The oven was filled with strange rabbit food, and we had to dispose of dozens of mail order catalogs addressed to someone who no longer lived there. We joked that the previous tenant had been some kind of Satanist, but now we weren't so sure. For a while, we both slept in the living room, feeling better together. But things took a darker turn one night when I had a dream. I dreamt that a dark presence was looming over me while I slept, and I could feel a growing pressure in my head, accompanied by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. It became so overwhelming that I woke up suddenly. As soon as I did, the TV in the room turned off, even though it had been on when I went to bed. We had been having problems with the TV turning off and on by itself, but this felt too coincidental to ignore. I was sure I had turned it off before bed, but there it was, running on its own. We moved into her room after that, as it seemed to be the only place where nothing strange happened. I don't know why it was different there. Maybe it was because it was an addition to the original cabin, but whatever the reason, it was the only place where we felt safe. Over time, though, the activity in the house seemed to calm down, although not entirely. One night, when I was upstairs reading, the windows in my room started opening and closing by themselves. I was at my breaking point with the strange occurrences. The next day, I set up the same situation, and once again, the windows behaved the same way. In a moment of frustration, I yelled at whatever was haunting the place, demanding it leave us alone. Miraculously, it worked for a while. The disturbances slowed down. The alarm clock would go off when my wife wasn't home, drawers would open by themselves, and sometimes there were loud bangs at the door, but it was less frequent. Eventually, everything stopped. As I grew older, the house didn't seem so frightening. Now, my in-laws live in the cabin. It's become a charming, cozy place, and I no longer feel the same sense of dread I once did. It's funny how time changes things. If I had to, I'd live there again. Instead of giving my boyfriend a typical Christmas present, I planned a weekend getaway at a cabin we found on Airbnb. Neither of us were big into outdoor activities, so I spent a lot of time looking for somewhere that offered privacy but wasn't too isolated. I wanted to be in a peaceful spot, but not in the middle of nowhere. Eventually, I found a place on the edge of a 500-acre farm, right by a river. It had a nice house and outdoor cooking facilities. When the weekend arrived, we were both excited to get away for a couple of days. It was just an hour and a half from home, but the drive turned out to be more complicated than we expected. The owner had given us the usual directions: turn left at the sign, right at the fork, and so on. After a bit of confusion, we finally made it to the general area he'd mentioned. We had ended up at another rental on the property, but after running into the housekeeper, we got back on track. We drove past the pigs, cows, and the main farmhouse. Everything was stunning and peaceful, but the last stretch of the road was something else. It wasn't much of a road at all, more like a narrow hiking trail barely wide enough for our truck. The bumps and twists made it feel like a challenge. After I spent a good 10 minutes freaking out in the passenger seat, we finally made it to the bottom of the hill, crossed a stream, and pulled up to the cabin. The first day and night went as planned. We met one of the farm workers in the morning and the farm's owner the next day. Both of them were really nice and gave us helpful tips. But around 7 p.m. on the second day, a truck pulled up next to ours. We thought it might be someone we had met or perhaps another farm worker dropping by, but we were wrong. 3 guys got out of the truck and waved at us like they were supposed to be there. We were sitting on the porch, and my 90-pound German Shepherd started barking like crazy. Not only was it intimidating, but it was also incredibly loud. I took the dog around to the other side of the cabin and sent my boyfriend to check out who these guys were. One of them asked him how the fishing was, and my boyfriend explained we hadn't been there long, but suggested they ask the farm owner, who lived nearby. The guy responded with something like, "Oh, I know, we live around here, just looking for a fishing spot." I texted the owner to let him know what was going on, but got no response. The guys then spread out and started taking photos of the property, even recording videos of themselves. They were speaking in a language I didn't recognize. Naturally, I started to get worried and texted the owner again, but still no reply. Eventually, the guys left, and I texted the owner once more, telling him they were heading back up and included the details of their truck. But again, no response. We decided we couldn't sleep that night, so we packed up our things and left. It's been 2 days since, and still nothing from the owner. When I had interacted with him, he was always friendly and approachable, so it just felt off for him to suddenly ignore us like this. Could have been nothing, but it was clear that these guys had been there before. They weren't just looking for a fishing spot. The location was private, not easy to get to, and they knew exactly where to go to get to the river. They had no problem driving through the marked private property, passing the main farmhouse, and going down a mountain for reasons I still don't understand. But I'm just glad I never had to figure it out. When I was a kid, I used to live on a farm. I grew up on a property with some strange local stories tied to it, so much so that many members of my indigenous family were too afraid to visit. The story was that an evil creature lived at the bottom of a nearby hill and would come out at night, tormenting people and playing tricks on them. As a child, I didn't really believe any of it, but then one night, I started having vivid, lifelike nightmares where I was chased by this thing around the property. It got so intense that I ended up in therapy after a year of constant nightmares. I tried to tell my family that I wanted to move, but they just thought I had too much of an overactive imagination. But it wasn't just the dreams that made everything so terrifying. On some days, we'd find chickens torn to pieces, and other times, goats would disappear without a trace. Friends would visit and never return, and sometimes late at night, we'd hear something chasing our horse in the fields. She would go wild, screaming into the night until the morning light. My sister and I eventually started to believe that this creature was real. One evening, a family friend came over and stayed in the cabin at the back of the property. That was the first time in months that I was able to sleep without being haunted by those nightmares. But that night, our family friend had the worst nightmares of his life. The next morning, he left without a word and never returned. He said that while packing, he dreamed something was chasing him, and when he woke up, he heard muffled crying outside the cabin. The building was shaking as if something was hitting the sides with all its might. The fear on that man's face stayed with me long after he drove away, and my parents refused to talk about it. Later that day, my sister and I went down to the cabin, and it looked as though it had been hit by a massive tremor. It was leaning to one side, and the inside was a wreck. A few months later, my parents sold the farm and we moved away, and after that, I never had those nightmares again. Years later, my siblings and I received an article about the farm, which detailed a murder-suicide that had happened there. The man who had bought the property had gone mad, murdered his wife, and then shot himself. My parents never spoke about it, but sometimes my siblings and cousins bring it up, sharing the trauma it caused us and our friends, many of whom refused to come back after their own terrifying experiences. The whole town is haunted in its own way. Everyone who leaves the place has some kind of haunting story, whether it's something based in logic or something supernatural. So many bad things have happened there. I wouldn't be surprised if there's something darker living on that land. If you want to dive into a tragic rabbit hole, look up the Bearrill murders. It's a very dark chapter in Australia's history, kind of like our version of Derry from it. I'm not sure if it was all in my head or if there was really something sinister happening, but after hearing about the murders that occurred years later, I'm starting to believe that whatever it was, it's still there, entering people's dreams, slaughtering the local animals, and haunting anyone who moves onto that land. In 2017, I was at a church event and we went on the Pioneer Trail because my mom convinced me to join, even though I wasn't excited about it. I had this strange feeling, though I couldn't place what was bothering me. It wasn't until the first night that I figured it out. We had been walking the trail for about 10 miles when we stopped to take a break. I ate with everyone else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I didn't want to say anything, thinking it was silly, like there was nothing out there except us. So we went back to our routine. I had eaten some spicy chips that night and ended up needing to use the bathroom, which I did. After that, I went back to the cabin, ready to sleep after a long day of activities. Before I could fall asleep, though, I heard a branch snap. I didn't think much of it, but then I heard another one, and then another. That's when I realized something was off. I decided to look out the window to see what was out there. When I looked, I froze. I saw a tall, thin, white figure. It had a ribcage visible through its transparent skin, with glowing red eyes. It seemed human, but just wrong. It was sniffing the air, like it was searching for something in the woods. I stared for a while, and then it slowly began turning in my direction. That's when I quickly jumped back into my bed, my heart racing. What was that thing? Was I imagining things? As I sat there, I could hear more branches snapping, but I kept my head down, not daring to look again. I woke up one of my cabin mates, and he stared at me for a long time when he saw how terrified I looked. "You all right?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he joked. I told him, "You don't want to know what I saw, but I want you to look with me." He reluctantly agreed. "There's nothing out there," he said, but as we looked, we saw it. The creature was closer now, still not facing us. We both ducked down and tried to ignore the sounds of breaking branches, hoping it would go away. After a while, we closed the blinds, but I opened them again about 30 minutes later. The creature was gone, but the forest was littered with broken branches. We didn't know what to do, so we just went back to sleep. We didn't tell the counselors about the creature. We just said we thought we heard a bear during the night. They sent a team to investigate, but all they found were a few strange tracks. We knew what we saw, but I haven't been back to the Pioneer Trail since. A few months later, I stayed in another cabin, far away from there. I was in New Hampshire visiting some buddies, and we rented a cabin deep in the forest for the night through a vacation rental site. I had a drink or two, but no one else was drinking. It had been a fun day filled with laughter, and by midnight, I was the last one still awake. I sat in the living room, soaking in the quiet atmosphere and reflecting on life. One thing that felt off was the complete lack of blinds or curtains on the windows, just bare glass looking out into the pitch-black woods. There were a lot of windows, and each one reflected nothing but darkness. Eventually, I went upstairs to sleep in a room I was sharing with my closest friend, though we had separate beds. Before getting into bed, I stood by the window, again thinking about how odd it was that there were no coverings. Crossed my mind that if someone was outside, they could easily see me from far away. Shrugging off the uneasy feeling, I lay down and instantly drifted off to sleep. I woke up to my friend looming over me, his hands wrapped around my throat. Both of us were screaming at the top of our lungs as we wrestled violently in the dark, struggling for our lives. The fight lasted about a minute. Glass shattered, furniture was knocked over, and the room was in chaos. Then, all of a sudden, my friend seemed to snap out of it and turned on the light. As we tried to process what had just happened, I could only remember waking up to him strangling me while screaming. But his memory was completely different. He said that he saw me standing over him, threatening him, and was suddenly overtaken by an uncontrollable rage that made him attack me. Confused and shaken, we went downstairs and talked through it. There were a few things we couldn't explain. First, we had only been asleep for about 10 minutes before it all started. Since deep sleep doesn't happen that fast, it was unlikely to be a dream-related event. Second, none of our other friends in the next room heard a thing, despite how loud and violent the struggle had been. After about 30 minutes of sitting downstairs, an overwhelming feeling of dread hit me, the worst I had ever felt. It was so intense that I truly believed I was about to die. A full-blown panic attack took over, and I started screaming for everyone to wake up and leave immediately. Within the hour, we packed up and left the cabin for good. Later, the owners checked the carbon monoxide detectors, but they were functioning properly. We never gave them the full details of what happened, but we agreed to cover the damages in the room. To this day, I have no idea what caused that terrifying experience. What do you think it could have been? In 2005, I went on a family trip to Gatlinburg, Tennessee. We rented a cabin in the mountains with 2 bedrooms downstairs and a loft room upstairs. The loft was enclosed, but it had a large folding window that could be opened to look down at the living room below. I chose the loft as my sleeping spot. One night, I went to bed earlier than everyone else. The folding window was shut, but light from the living room was leaking through the cracks and softly lit the room. I put on my headphones, inserted my favorite CD into my disc player, and laid down on the bed. I was lying on my back, eyes shut, fiddling with the CD player to change the song. I couldn't quite figure it out, so I opened my eyes to look for the button. When I did, all I could see was darkness. I was confused because the light from the window was gone, and the room was pitch black. Suddenly, I realized something was covering my eyes. It began to move away from me, revealing parts of its body in the faint light from the window. I froze, staring at the creature, which quickly flew toward the top corners of the room, disappearing into the shadows. I pulled the covers over my head, squeezed my eyes shut, and turned the volume up on my headphones as loud as it would go. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I told my mom about what happened. She shared that she'd experienced something odd that same morning. She had been sitting on the edge of her bed, putting on socks, when she noticed one of the handles of the dresser drawer lifting up and dropping back down. She watched it for a minute before reaching over to hold it down. Then, another drawer handle began doing the same thing. She held that one down too, but when a third started, she quickly ran out of the room. A few years later, I was telling this story to a new friend, and when I described the creature, he said it sounded like a wraith. I had never heard of that before, so he showed me some pictures. When I saw the images, tears started rolling down my face, not from sadness, but from an odd reaction of my body. It was strange to me, but the creature in the pictures was exactly what I had seen that night, and it remains one of the creepiest experiences I've ever had. We stayed in a rustic cabin built in the 1970s for my bachelorette weekend. It was old, but not too ancient. The cabin was located in Lake Haven, New York. To give you some context, this happened on the first night. There were 6 of us in total. 2 of my friends were just outside the kitchen grilling dinner, while the other 4 were sitting around the small kitchen table. The table was right next to the counter and sink. We hadn't started drinking much yet. I think we had one shot that our bartender friend made for us using a cocktail shaker. I mention this because the top of the shaker was sitting on the counter right next to the shaker itself. Now, here comes the strange part. Out of nowhere, the shaker top flew across the room about 5 feet, landing very close to one of my friends. We all saw it happen. At first, I thought my friend outside had thrown it at us as a prank, but I knew it was still on the counter and she was outside. I could tell everyone was confused. Some of my friends jumped up, and we all started asking what had just occurred. Eventually, we ran outside, screaming. In the end, we decided to just brush it off. I was always taught not to give too much attention to things like that, but I do know the top didn't just slide off the counter due to gravity. There was no wind that could have blown it. It was as if someone had thrown it across the room. I've never seen anything like it. Nothing else unusual happened during the rest of our stay, but one of my friends swears she heard deep, muffled voices coming from the TV while she was watching Netflix. Another friend backs her up, but I'm not sure what to believe. So yeah, it's possible that Airbnbs can be haunted. No one mentioned anything about it in the reviews, and neither did I. This was back in 2023. In the middle of the woods, high up in the hills of a small town called Pine Ridge, Tennessee, the neighborhood was located about half an hour from the nearest town, and the houses were spread far apart. The porch of the cabin was completely open to the wilderness, and I knew that wild animals could wander through if they wished. But I stayed there for a week with my boyfriend, and every night we sat out on the porch well into the night. Not once did we feel threatened. It was calm, with fireflies flickering and the sound of crickets every evening. That was until the 5th night. The air was strangely dark, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. It was around midnight, and all of a sudden, the usual peace vanished. The forest became completely silent, and I was overwhelmed with a terrible feeling of fear. I felt like something was wrong. I sat there in my chair, staring into the pitch-black woods, trying to convince myself that my mind was just playing tricks. But out of nowhere, my boyfriend said he didn't feel right. I admitted I felt the same, and we quickly rushed inside. The cabin had 3 levels, and we decided to climb out of the window and sit on the roof because we wanted to stay outside in the stillness. But even though I was high above the ground, the sense that something was wrong never left me. I could feel it deep in my bones. I stayed indoors for the rest of the night. The only other time I'd felt anything like that was in a haunted house, where it felt like someone was always watching me. If anyone has gone through something similar or has any thoughts on what might have happened, I'd love to hear your experiences. When I was younger, my friends and I used to explore abandoned buildings, searching for anything spooky. There's a small shack near where I live that people always say is haunted, so we decided to check it out for ourselves. To get to the shack, you have to go through an opening in a fence. It's not exactly a gate, more like a narrow path that weaves through the wooden posts. You go left, then right. We made our way through and reached the shack. It had a creepy vibe, but nothing too strange at first. I stepped outside to look around the field when I suddenly heard my friend, a 16-year-old girl, let out a blood-curdling scream, like she had just witnessed something horrible. My other friend and I ran to find her. He had been in another part of the house at the time. When we got to her, she was curled up in a corner of the kitchen, head down, sobbing uncontrollably. All the cupboards and drawers were wide open, even though we were sure they had been shut before. We kept asking her what had happened, but she wouldn't answer, just kept crying and saying she needed to leave. As we walked back to our cars, we noticed something weird. Right on one of the fence posts, the same one we had walked through earlier, there was a small flower, freshly uprooted and placed on a little mound of dirt. It definitely wasn't there when we first came in. We left and never went back. To this day, my friend refuses to tell us what she saw. I was in a small cabin in the far north of Wisconsin, near Lake Superior. It was late, and I was in the living room while the rest of my family was asleep. Suddenly, I heard strange sounds coming from the backyard, like someone was fiddling with the shed doors or moving around the firewood piles. The motion-activated lights turned on, and I caught a glimpse of a shadow passing by the kitchen window, but it was too fast for me to see clearly. I froze, too scared to move, just staring at the back windows and the patio door, which had its blinds drawn. About a minute later, I heard what sounded like the door being nudged open. The noise grew louder until I couldn't help but scream and jump up. As soon as I screamed, it stopped. My stepdad rushed out of the bedroom, asking what was going on. I told him what had happened, but he told me I was probably imagining things. Just then, something hit the glass door hard and tried to open it again. My stepdad grabbed a shotgun from the rack and aimed it at the blinds. He pressed his face to the glass, trying to look around the door to see what was out there. Still, there was nothing. So he opened the door, hoping to scare whatever it was away. I stood maybe 5 feet behind him. That's when we both saw something huge and upright dart from behind the shed into the woods. It let out a terrifying scream, unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard before. My stepdad fired a shot as it vanished into the dark. We never spoke about that night for 20 years. The fear of not knowing what we saw stayed with me. I figured it was finally time to share my story. I went on a week-long camping trip in the mountains, just like any typical camp, with archery, rock climbing, and all that. My instructor shared a strange story about a young girl who drowned in the lake. For some background, the lake where the kids would take canoes out is also a place for swimming during the warmer months. It was winter when I went, so the water was far too cold for that. However, the area used to have thick reeds growing that you could hide behind, and that's where the girl wandered off to. This girl didn't know how to swim, so she went off from the group to practice on her own, to avoid being teased. But she went to a spot that was deeper than she realized and sank. No one found her until it was too late, and she had already drowned. The part of the story I immediately dismissed as nonsense was when he said that on some nights, you could hear her crying. Then one night, I woke up late, desperately needing to use the bathroom. They made us drink a lot of water during camp, and with all the windows open because my instructor was a very large man, I heard something strange. Everyone else was asleep, and from outside the cabin, I could hear the sound of a girl crying in the distance. I was laying under the covers, trying not to give in to the urge to pee, completely terrified. Eventually, I bolted out of bed and rushed to the bathroom. When I carefully crept back to my bed, the crying had stopped. I didn't hear it again that night or any other night. Just to clarify, the boys' cabin was small, and if any kid had been crying, we all would have heard it. The same goes for the girls' cabin. There's no way we'd have heard a girl crying in the boys' cabin unless she was really loud, like screaming for help. Other kids also said they heard it, but I don't know how sincere they were. Lots of kids like to make things up for attention. I can say with certainty though, the crying sounded like it was only a few meters away from the cabin, just outside. Even now, thinking back, it sends shivers down my spine. The sound of that crying was so clear, so real, and I had been so skeptical about it before. I can't say for sure if it was the ghost of that little girl, but there was something about it that felt real. It was the 4th week of summer camp, and I was working as a camp counselor in the mountains. It was the weekend, and there were no campers on the grounds, just us 7 counselors. Everyone was hanging out in the break room, except for Alex. He had been assigned to stay alone in the hawk cabin because he was the only guy working that weekend. It was late, and Alex had gone to bed. In his sleep, he began to dream. In the dream, he saw a young girl dancing on top of a bunk bed, singing, "I'm Riley, I'm Riley." Then, she looked at Alex, jumped off the bed, and ended up breaking her leg. Terrified, Alex woke up and checked the room, but found it empty. Too spooked to fall back asleep, he headed down to the break room for some company. A minute later, our camp director walked in and asked Alex, "Who was that little girl who walked out of your room?" A few days after everyone had calmed down, a new group of campers arrived. On the first day, we took them on a hike along the trail, singing camp songs and getting to know one another. One of my campers was telling me about a vivid dream she had, and I shared my own story about a dream where everything was weightless. As I was talking, one of the other campers in front of me turned around and said she had a strange dream too. She described being in hawk cabin, where a little girl with a broken leg was trying to dance around. Back in 5th grade, my class and I